it, and I will speak to that association I have with this own story here, with this particular story. Again, I think it's a great story. This story is one that comes down to all of us right out of the American West. It comes down to us right out of California's past. It comes down to us right out of Chico's story. And it is the story of John Bidwell, a white-skinned man, and his journey across the United States in a wagon in 1841 as a part of a group of Americans that are going to come into California overland before anyone has done that very thing.
Wow.
Tried to come across Utah and Nevada and over the Sierras into California before anyone has done that with the intention of staying. Fur trappers had done that previously. Bidwell's party would be the first, and 33 people would make that journey and down into California at the end of October and into the first few days of November 1841. So again, a great story. And Bidwell holds a place in the history of the United States for this achievement here of being a part and being a leader of this first group of people to come overland. Most of us are aware, most of us are of an age where we have grown up at a time when that story of the American West was still seen as an epic story, a positive story, a positive part of the American history. Now today, of course, the story is clouded in shadows, and we are probably all aware how that is playing out here through our American culture. So, again here with this first image, I think I try to express that earlier image, this American saga that happened here with the overland travel to the West. And of course Bidwell, here we see John Bidwell about 1850, 10 years after he has made the journey to California, and we see a copy, a reprint of his journal that he would make as he came overland. And Bidwell would really achieve a distinction here among the handful of people who did keep journals and diaries during the overland experience, and then those journals would make their way back east and be reprinted and serve as a context for guidebooks about overland travel that would so help people coming after those first few groups there. So Bidwell, again, would leave behind this single document, but after his arrival in California, the body of Bidwell's writings. He was a prodigious writer throughout the rest of his adult life. And so his essays, his journals, his diaries, his letters, his speeches, his magazine articles that he put together, again, are a very important part of the California story there. So again, most of us are aware just a little of that Bidwell story as it played out after his arrival in California. We see, of course, the upper left, that overland travel. Bidwell is here in California for 6 years before the discovery of gold. He travels the full length of California on horseback and on foot during that 6 years there. He would be a surveyor for John Sutter and for the Mexican government in laying out these land grants that were given out here in Northern California during that stretch of time. And again, Bidwell would make this very map here in 1843-44 and later acquire the Rancho del Arroyo Chico land grant. Again, Bidwell was here when gold was discovered, and he would find a fortune in gold on the Feather River. His mining camp there, lower right, Bidwell Bar on the Middle Fork of the Feather River, underneath Lake Oroville today. But Bidwell would use the fortune in gold that he found to buy that Rancho del Arroyo Chico. And of course, after that, Bidwell would have a heralded career as a politician, locally, statewide, and even nationally. He would build roads here out of Chico, the Humboldt Wagon Road. He would lay out a new community here. You see there, upper middle, the street grid for the very street system we're using right now outside the doors here, a new community of Chico. His Bidwell building right on the corner of First and Broadway. The downstairs, the first story of that building still standing today. And of course, Bidwell's interaction with other ethnic groups, including the native people that were living here, the Chinese. Again, I believe Bidwell was a person who tried to treat everyone with respect and inclusiveness. And again, that would be a part of his legacy. Again, his contribution to California agriculture was really unmatched. Again, always his most lucrative crop was winter wheat. And Bidwell would early on establish a flour mill right on the banks of Chico Creek and directly across from today's, what's left of the Bidwell Mansion. And so that mill would be right there on that esplanade crossing of Chico Creek. Bidwell would receive the medal in 1877, I believe, from the French International Exposition as having grown the finest wheat in the world. But again, Bidwell's interest in agriculture was always beyond winter wheat. It really was about fruits and vegetables and all things agriculture. And Bidwell's real contribution would be to really set that first table for a very diverse and expanded agricultural story here in California. Again, he would build that beautiful house for himself. And here we see in 1868, John and Annie are sitting on that front porch as Annie has just arrived here in Chico and taken up residency here in this grand building that Bidwell has put together. They would host together many famous people. Here lower left we see President Rutherford Hayes on the left, and John and Annie on the far right there as they are touring Rancho Chico. Again, Bidwell would lay out the esplanade in upper middle. You see that early picture of the esplanade taken from the Bidwell Water Tower. Bidwell would put that curious design that we've still got there with the main central driveways and then those side streets on each side and separated by rows of trees. And so we're still using that. Far right, upper right there, you see Bidwell as the keynote speaker in 1887 as the cornerstone for the new California State Normal School is being laid right here on Bidwell's earlier cherry orchard. And this, of course, would transition to our university today. Bidwell always supported education. He was always a person hungry to expand his own education, his own knowledge base. And of course, the City of Trees he would leave behind part of his ranch that had not been markedly changed. It had been left in its natural state, and would leave that behind, I think, as a testimony to the beauty and the grandeur of this California environment. And so he's remembered for all of this. Well, we just took a brief overview of Bidwell's achievement. Has this really left him in good standing? Here just recently, I was up in Upper Bidwell Park, and I was standing right here looking down at Salmon Hole, and I went over to the Salmon Hole parking lot, and there on the back of that sign, look what somebody has put. Bidwell was a colonizer, and don't forget. And on that bottom picture there, you can see that somebody has scratched some additional commentary there. What's it say? It says, so are you, and so is everything a colonizer, and don't forget. And I like that, because that's the way I really see this. I see this Bidwell story as a part of our human story on our planet that was carried out at a time when these kinds of brands and judgments that are put on the past were not really being made in the same light as today. So, here is what we see coming out of the changing attitude of many of our fellow citizens. So, again, before I get into that Bidwell story, just to touch on this, there in the lower left you see my sweet mama and my sister, 1953, standing there by the corner of the mansion. Our father has brought us all there. My brother and I were there, but as soon as the door opened to the car, we ran off down to the creek, and we didn't want our picture taken. And so again, I grew up here just 5 blocks away from this spot, and so it's been a place that I've been familiar with and spent time roaming around since I was a boy. Again, those other 2 pictures just suggest the time period that I grew up in. The 2-gun kid there I am on the left. And again, we all remember, most of us that are older, like me, remember those 1950s and 60s where the stories out of the American West were really so popular on television and in literature. And later, as a 27-year-old who was old enough to really know better, maybe, but no. Here we see upper middle, my 3 friends and I, we drove a car out of Chico, drove back to the middle of Nebraska, sold our car there, and set out to walk back to Chico on the Oregon Trail. And so, upper left, you see us walking along the Platte River. You're going to see that in a minute. You see us over on the other side out across Utah, where the miles are stretching out and we are getting pooped. But again, down below, one of the greatest days of my life, we're following these ruts of the Oregon Trail out across the high plains of Wyoming, and now we can see the beautiful Wind River Range mountains towering up there, another 7,000 feet on the horizon. Yes, a great adventure here for me and my friends. Well, certainly our stretch along the Oregon Trail was far different than we're going to hear about that Bidwell story. Food security was not an issue for us. And of course, the only buffalo we saw were in the Scottsbluff Zoo. The one thing we did have that the Bidwell Party didn't have, maps. Wow. Maps. We carried a bundle of maps with us, topo maps, highway maps, and there was never a question about how to get, what route to take to go where we wanted to go. So, we're going to step in here to my effort, my hope that I can give some context to this Bidwell story. Today, of course, to see our planet, to understand its physical layout, we can look at it from space. We can see the whole of it. And what a revolution there. And to wonder, to drop back 500 years in time to a point where the movement of people out of Europe is just really getting underway, and to see the understanding of the world, its makeup, and how people did not have a complete and accurate understanding not only of the physical makeup, but people, of course, are carrying a different understanding of themselves, other people around them, their own bodies. Again, the knowledge base that has advanced since this moment here is really what I am hopefully going to convey. So again, as we go through and see the map, the world of maps, and how that begins to reflect the exploration that is going on all over the world. 1519, the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan would leave Spain with 5 ships and 270 men, and they would set out to try to sail around the world. The thinking is just now becoming a real question mark and a supposed truth that people are living on a round world. It's not flat. Yeah. And so Magellan doesn't make that 3-year journey himself. He dies en route, but some of his men and 2 of his ships would make that first circumnavigation of the planet. And again, we know that there were others, many others, sailing about all over the world, yes, claiming lands for their king and queen back in Europe, but slowly, the knowledge of how our planet is put together is gaining. And you can see on that map there on the right, yeah, by about 1650, 1700, there's a pretty good understanding of that east coast of the United States. It's not the United States yet, but North America. But look at that interior and out toward the Pacific. Really, again, it's unknown land. We all know what happened here, and we all were all but breastfed on this story as young people, many of us here that grew up in the 50s and 60s. And again, this picture is only to suggest, not the right and wrong of it, but what happened here, where people with a different way, a different technology, a different full understanding of culture came across the ocean from Europe and really bringing their religion, their weapons, their warfare, their culture, and it, of course, would clash with the people that were already here. And part of our story. Again, soon people stayed here and built their homes here and found a freedom here and a different livelihood in this new world, as it was called. Again, I think that map on the far right, 1797, again, we see the North America now pretty well laid out, but we see that western half of North America still largely unexplored.
Yeah.
We know right in through here there's a revolution. There's actually a war between the people here in this new world in North America and forces from Europe. And this is the revolution of the whole planet over the last 500 years. To step beyond the kings and queens, to step beyond control by the priests and the ministers of church and the strongmen and authoritarians. It's an effort to build a new arrangement for governing ourselves. Yeah, we all know it's not perfect, but quite a wonderful story. And so we know after that revolution that really unleashed this new individual, this new American, who really saw life differently and began to push west. And much of this impulse of moving west was really created and supported by thousands, and then tens of thousands, and then hundreds of thousands of people leaving Europe to try to find a better life for themselves, because they're still living under this feudal structure of kings and queens and wars. And so they don't like it. They want to reach for something better. And they come across and they land on the East Coast, and that pushes everyone else further west there. And so I'm going to use a pointer and pretend I'm some kind of teacher here and get this little tip out here. And so I want to talk about this for just a minute, and then I'll step back. So again, let's look at this map, 1803, 1806, and some things are happening here in this new United States. You can see here how it's really solidified along the eastern seaboard and inland. There's some new territories here that haven't quite become states yet. But in 1803, our president, Thomas Jefferson, will purchase from France the French claim to the Louisiana country. And in 1682, this Frenchman, Robert LaSalle would start clear up here in the Great Lakes. He would float all the way down the Mississippi, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And he would float down and he would turn and claim everything for his king, Louis XIV. And that's how we got this Louisiana, Louis XIV. So now the French are now selling that claim to the Americans. And the United States will now send this Lewis and Clark expedition. It takes shape back here as President Jefferson arranges for this expedition and picks the people to lead it. They move out here down the Ohio River to the Mississippi and then up to St. Louis. And that's where the expedition will start. They will come up the Missouri and spend their first winter somewhere in here. Then in that year of 1805, they will make it all the way across here and spend their second winter here in a little enclave of structures they would build there, a shelter. And then the following 1806, they would come all the way back. One of the main objectives of this Lewis and Clark expedition would be to see if a wagon route could be found to come out to the Oregon country. Because the United States had a claim here to the Oregon country. How had that happened? 1792, an American sea captain sailing his sailing ship, the Columbia, would go all the way down around South America, up here along the west coast of North America, and he would find himself offshore, moving north, when he got up into here and he could feel the swell and the surge of some kind of water coming from the shore. He guessed there was a big river coming down into the ocean there. And he would go to explore that. He would find the mouth of this large river. He would take his boat across the sandbar there at the mouth and up into the large river that he would name the Columbia after his boat. And he would turn and go, I claim the whole watershed for the United States. So now the United States has a claim here, as do the British. And this would not be really ironed out until the 1840s. So, again, the objective here, one, is to see if a wagon route could be found across the country and out to this claim that the United States now has. Of course, that Lewis and Clark story, again, a drawing, a painting by Charlie Russell, the famous painter of the American West. Again, the contact between this new people here from the East and the native people out in that country. Again, a great story in itself. But here's a map that came back from Lewis and Clark. And Lewis and Clark would say, yes, we had a marvelous expedition across, but there was no real way that we saw or even heard about an easy way across these Rocky Mountains here, these squiggle lines here, the different segments of that larger Rocky Mountain system. No way. It would really be these people who would really iron out a wagon route across the midsection of North America. And this would be the American fur trappers. Immediately following the return of the Lewis and Clark expedition and now this American claim to the Louisiana country, men like this would move out into that Rocky Mountain country trapping. The American fur trapping era. It lasted about 25 years, and these men were out there to trap animals with valuable skins, and especially the beaver, which was popular in Europe. Their beaver skins would be used to dress out clothing, putting little strips of fur around your collar or here at your cuffs. And so the beaver, and make hats, make the famous beaver skin hat. And so again, the beaver pelts were valuable. It took people out there to look for them and trap them. And again, it would be the fur trappers who would find a way to cross the Rocky Mountains with wagons. So, we're getting close now to the Bidwell story. And it's just a few pictures away, but let's look one more time. Okay, let's say by 1840. Let's go 1840, just a year before the Bidwell overland experience. The Oregon Trail is now taking shape, and it's really headed for Oregon. And it will begin along the Missouri River at these jump-off places here, Independence, St. Joseph, Council Bluffs, Weston, and really today's Kansas City is about right here where these small communities once stood. And again, you'd come up to the Platte River here, and you can see the Platte right here, and going on to go into the Missouri River here at Council Bluffs. You'd go over and hit the Platte and follow the Platte River valley on up past Fort Laramie and out here to cross the Continental Divide right here at South Pass, and then the trail would make its way all the way to the Oregon country. It was the fur trappers in 1830 that brought the first wagons from St. Louis on up here, across South Pass with a wagon with supplies for the fur trappers' annual rendezvous. According to accounts, a wild, alcohol-fueled debauchery held annually out there where the trappers would bring their fur pelts and trade them for supplies and keep them out there for another year. So again, nobody has yet thought about or tried to do this, to come down off the Oregon Trail, down across Idaho, into Utah, today's Nevada, into California. No one has yet tried that. All right. One last map, and I like this because it shows us how that trail could go across the Continental Divide right there in the midsection of North America, right there. So again, St. Louis right here, look at this, the Mississippi coming down here, what a huge river. And then the Missouri, with these big headwaters, rivers up here, bringing the Missouri down and into the Mississippi here at St. Louis, one of the world's great river systems. You can see again, you'd come up here and jump off in here and get up here to the Platte River. Here it is. You can see the Platte, two forks right here, the North Fork with its headwaters up here at 11,000 feet in the Rockies, and the South Fork here. And so you'd get out here and hit the Platte, use its waters, follow it up, Fort Laramie right about here. But look, this break in the Rocky Mountains here allowed wagons to slide through here, get through this little bit right here, and over here to the Snake River, where again, the journey could proceed on to Oregon. And then, of course, later, the Bidwell party is going to try to come right here. So, there it is. Oh, did I skip one? Wait a minute. Okay. I'm going to check. Yep, okay. Yeah, there we go. So, I'm going to put this thing down. Let's now move to the Bidwell story. And I've got that little picture of John Bidwell himself in that upper corner to remind me to read a little piece of his Overland Journal as we will now begin the story of that Bidwell party. And so again, Bidwell will comment to us about how steamboats were really the major travel item here. And here we see St. Louis there, I think, in the upper left there, just to show us how numerous those big steamboats were and how pivotal that capability of moving people and supplies really built up trade right there along the rivers and further east there. So again, let's read what John Bidwell has to say as he is now ready to make this journey to California. In the spring of 1839, living at the time in the western part of Ohio, being then in my 20th year, I conceived a desire to see the great prairies of the West, especially those most frequently spoken of in Iowa and Missouri. Immigration from the east was tending westward, and settlers had already begun to invade those rich fields. Starting on foot to Cincinnati, 90 miles distant, I fortunately got a chance to ride most of the way on a wagon loaded with farm produce. My outfit consisted of about $75, the clothes I wore, and a few others in a knapsack, which I carried in the usual way, strapped upon my shoulders. For in those days, travelers did not have valises or trunks. Though traveling was considered dangerous, I had no weapon more formidable than a pocket knife. From Cincinnati, I went down the Ohio River by steamboat to the Mississippi, up the Mississippi to St. Louis, and thence into what was then the territory of Iowa. Those were bustling days on the western rivers, which were then the chief highways of travel. All right, let's see where we go from there. So again, we're going to be seeing several paintings here by this single American artist, William Henry Jackson. And I will take just a minute to tell you about him, because I think his paintings provide us with a wonderful illustration of what overland travel was like. And again, William Henry Jackson, born in 1843, served with the Union Army in the Civil War, and then, after the war was over, Jackson would move himself out to the frontier along the Missouri River, where he would take up photography. And he would quickly establish himself as a very capable and creative photographer, and he soon was invited to be the photographer for the 1870 federal expedition into the Rocky Mountain country. And so Jackson's photographs of that expedition would come back and be a pivotal influence on legislators back in Washington, who would decide to make a national park out of that Yellowstone country there after Jackson's photographs. After that, Jackson would decide that his life's work from then on would be to document this story of westward movement. And in his 70s, 80s, and 90s, Jackson would go back to painting, which was his original artistic skill, and he would paint hundreds of paintings about this overland experience. So here we see a Jackson picture showing how steamboats would bring immigrants up the Missouri out of St. Louis and then unload wagons and people, where they would camp for a week or two as they organized themselves and drew up agreements of cooperation amongst themselves before they set out west. This is the only real picture that I really am aware of this specific Bidwell story. And it shows the Bidwell party setting out from their campsite there just off the Missouri River in May of 1841. Preceding this moment, Bidwell is living there in Missouri. He's 20 years old. He tries to claim a piece of land so he can become a farmer, somebody jumps his claim and will not back down, a bully. And so Bidwell determined, I'm going to have to try something else. At the same time, people all over this part of Missouri would begin to hear the story of this wonderland called California. For there was a fur trapper trader, Anton Robidoux, who was just returning from California and began to tell people about this wonderful spot. There's no winter out there. Fertile soil. It's a wonderful spot. People are friendly, even the Indians. And so Bidwell thinks, well, maybe this is the spot where I can start again. And so in that winter of 1840-41, a swell of people there in that Missouri country will sign the pledge to all congregate in the spring of 41, ready to make this overland trip. You will bring your outfit that you've put together and be ready to make the trip. Well, Bidwell, as one of the leaders and supporters, he gets his stuff together and he goes out to that Missouri meeting spot, and there's only one other wagon. Wow. Everybody else now has got cold feet. And they're excited about, we'll wave goodbye to you. I hope you make it. But they're not ready to take that jump yet. But slowly, a few dribble in, a few more wagons dribble in, until finally there's a small party ready to leave. About 60 people. But this is an real important part of the Bidwell story. And again, who is this person out in front? The Bidwell party was ready to leave, and they would say, our knowledge of the landscape ahead of us, we knew nothing. We knew nothing. We only knew that California lay to the west. But they would hear that a second party was now approaching up the river and was going to be here in a few more days. A group of Catholic Jesuit missionaries headed for the Idaho country to establish a mission for the native people out there. And they had a leader in Thomas Fitzpatrick, one of the most celebrated and well-known and experienced fur trappers out of that American fur trapping story. Fitzpatrick had been with Jedediah Smith as co-leaders of that 1824 first fur trapping group to cross the Continental Divide at South Pass and understand what they had done. They understood, we can cross the Continental Divide right here. The waters go to the west here on one way and back to the east the other. And so again, the fur trappers would use that knowledge to take their wagons 6 years later up the Platte and over the South Pass. And so the missionaries have hired Thomas Fitzpatrick to be their guide going west. And so the Bidwell party makes the decision to wait for this missionary group to come up with their guide. And here you can see them leaving now. The missionaries are traveling with 6 two-wheel carts and 1 small wagon. And the Bidwell group, 13 wagons, 61 people, including 15 women and children. And so here they go, heading west. And of course, out onto the Great Plains. It would take them about 10 days to leave their jumping off spot to reach the Platte River out across the Great Plains here. And of course, for my friends and I, getting ourselves out here onto the plains and selling our car and setting off on foot, it was a enormously exciting new experience, because the vista, never was there some kind of horizon one could really see off in the far distance. Always just the land melting away into the sky. And so, in 11 days of travel, that Bidwell party would reach the Platte. And of course, the Platte today is still a broad, shallow, braided river with islands and little sections there where sandbars break the river up. It was always like this, but really in those early days, it was considerably different. And here you can see the Platte. And of course, crossing the Platte in this William Henry Jackson painting, this was the most dangerous part of the entire journey. And it said that when snow melt came pouring down out of the Rocky Mountains in the springtime, the Platte was a mile wide and an inch deep. It was too thick to plow, too thin to drink. It was just a muddy, broad sheet of water coming down, and that torrent of water would wash away the vegetation that might have gotten started along the Platte. And so there was very little vegetation along the Platte, really, and you can see it here. And of course, once the Platte was dammed up in the 20th century for flood control and for agriculture, then Arbor Day would originate here in Nebraska to plant trees along the Platte. And so, the overland travelers would reach the Platte River Valley, and for some month they would move up the valley there, right up the Platte, using the water, of course, that everything had to have, stock animals and people, and making their way west. Another Jackson. And of course they would begin to see these landmarks that became established through the diaries kept, and then getting back to where those diaries could be reprinted, and people now setting out could go, yeah, we should look for these rocks. Oh yeah, there's Courthouse and Jailhouse Rock, and you can see them today there. Famous landmarks on the trail, maybe the most famous, Chimney Rock, still out there. And I'm going to read you what Bidwell had to say. About 12 o'clock today, we passed another object of interest. It is called by the mountaineers the chimney, from its resemblance to that object, and is composed of clay and sand so completely compact as to possess the hardness of rock. It stands near the high bluffs that bound the valley on the south, and is seen towering like a huge column at the distance of 30 miles. The column is on the whole about 250 feet above the level of the plain. Distance made today, about 20 miles. So again, we hear several interesting things. Bidwell says the Chimney Rock is about 250 feet. In truth, it was about 425. And again, we can see that upper left image there showing quite a higher rock. It's true, Chimney Rock has lost 50, 60 feet of its height there in the time since the wagons rolled by it. And then on up to Scotts Bluff. Let's see what Bidwell says here. The following day, Saturday, June 19th, we gradually receded from the river in order to pass through a gap in a range of high hills called Scotts Bluff. As we advanced toward these hills, the scenery of the surrounding country became beautifully grand and picturesque. They were worn in such a manner by the storms of unnumbered seasons that they really counterfeited the lofty spires, the towering edifices, the spacious domes, and in finery, all the beautiful mansions of cities. We encamped among these envious objects, having come about 20 miles. So again, Scotts Bluff pressed itself right down to the edge of the Platte, and so you had to go up and around the back side of it. Scotts Bluff had taken its name from an early fur trapper. In that very first season of the trappers moving up the Platte into the Rockies, a grizzly bear had come charging out of somewhere and mauled will be there. And so again, Hiram Scott leaving his name here, Scotts Bluff. And again, this just shows how today's interstate highway goes up the backside of Scotts Bluff, just as the wagon road had done. And there, up there at the top of Scotts Bluff, a national monument to the Oregon Trail experience with the largest collection of William Henry Jackson photographs and pictures anywhere. Again, Buffalo, again, another great story from our own American past. At one time, there were 30, 40, 50 million buffalo out on the Great Plains. By 1890, there were barely 200 left. And those really, fortunately, were taken in by people who wanted to try to save the species. And today, they're making a comeback, and there are chunks of the Great Plains now that are, again, inhabited by free-roaming buffalo there. And of course, Bidwell would write about the danger to the party if the buffalo stampeded through your wagon trains there. And again, we can see another William Henry Jackson painting of that moment there. And the Bidwell party would experience this, a tornado out on the Great Plains, where Bidwell would account seeing the tornado taking shape and moving toward them, and there was a wild pell-mell effort by people to get their animals to run full, taking the wagons out of the way of this oncoming tornado. And fortunately, the tornado would swerve off and out away from the group and bypass them. But Bidwell said the hailstorm that followed this was absolutely life-threatening in itself, with hailstones as big as turkey eggs coming down.
Whoa, that's
And again, the trail then would come up to Fort Laramie. This had been originally a fur trapping trading post where the Laramie Fork of the Platte River came into the main Platte River itself. And this, again, was an outpost that had been put in place in the 1830s. Later, the United States government would purchase this site and make it the single biggest and most powerful American military outpost in the far west, where large numbers of people were stationed, and really it was felt the military presence there was so strong that no real attack could be made against the fort, and the walls there were taken down. Then it would fade in the 1890s and all but disappear, and then would be repurchased by the American government, the United States government, and put back into a national monument. And then, just west of Laramie, one would come to this, the Sweetwater River, a tributary of the Platte coming in from the very continental divide itself. And of course, for my friends and I, coming to this point, it was a marked change in water quality. It was clean and cold and clear, a mountain stream now coming out of the high country and down into the Platte. And so for those people of earlier days, sweet water. The Platte was just often so muddy and not that pleasant to drink. And so the Sweetwater would provide, again, water going further west, right to the Continental Divide. On the Sweetwater would come this maybe most famous landmark on the trail, Independence Rock. And there you can see that large hump of a rock there that a party of fur trappers had reached on July 4th. And so it was given that name, Independence Rock, and people would start to scratch their names into the rock itself. And Bidwell, I don't believe, no, I'm not going to read there, but Bidwell would talk about how his party was eager to scratch their names in, and so they took all morning there out of camp, going up onto the rock and carving their names into the rock itself. And then they would get underway shortly after noon. And again, beyond the Independence Rock in that upper left picture, really in both pictures, you can see another famous landmark, Devil's Gate, where the Sweetwater cut through that far rocky cliff there. And so here you can see people up on top of the rock carving their names in, and of course many of these names are still visible today, along with other names that have been scratched in there in subsequent years. And then from Independence Rock, still 150 miles to the Continental Divide at South Pass. And really, for my friends and I, this was really the most exciting stretch of our walk right along the Oregon Trail. Wild, open country, and nobody out there. The ruts of the old trail are still very visible. It's said that there are two things that people out in space can see back down on planet Earth that are human-made. The Great Wall of China and the ruts of the Oregon Trail are still really evident and visible. And again, wide open country, nobody out there, a lot of antelope still, and sagebrush, really. We had a lot of great campfires with sagebrush. And then finally, the Wind River Range comes into view out there, and you can see the winds off on the horizon, towering up another 6,500 feet above the South Pass itself there. Again, the winds, world famous for mountain climbing. People come from all over the world there to mountain climb and explore and ramble and camp in the Wind River Range, a national park, a national forest wilderness area. And then finally, again, right to that Continental Divide where the waters go west to the Pacific and east back to the Mississippi, Missouri. And again, those far off distant buttes, the Oregon buttes, in the western watershed now of the United States. So I'm going to go back to one more map. I think it's the last one, but I want to point out to you a little bit about what's going to happen now. So again, the parties come up here. They've gone through South Pass right about here. Now they go down to Fort Bridger, a fur trapping outpost here to try to get information about the trail ahead. Then they move up this way to Soda Springs. Soda Springs. And we're going to see a picture of that in a minute. Already a well-known landmark out here with active geysers and bubbling mud pots. And right up here, this little dotted line is Fort Hall. Another fur trapper era landmark and outpost there in today's Idaho, right along the Snake River. So the party is looking for information about the trail ahead, and of course the Bidwell party is really looking for information for, as I pointed out before, right there, the group going on up here into Idaho and is going to go up this way, but the Bidwell party now is going to leave the Oregon Trail and head for California. And there is absolutely no marked route there for them to follow. And so, what will happen? Right there at their reaching Soda Springs, and there's Soda Springs there, a group will go on up to Fort Hall to seek information, but half the Bidwell party will determine at this point, it seems too dangerous to head for California. Mr. Fitzpatrick has offered to lead us to Oregon. We're going to go that way. And so half the party would divide right there at Soda Springs and follow Thomas Fitzpatrick up the Oregon Trail and all the way to Oregon. 33 people would determine to press on to California. All right, let's see. Yeah, Wednesday, August 11th. Having traveled about 6 miles this morning, the company came to a halt. The Oregon Company were now going to leave Bear River for Fort Hall, which is situated on the Snake River, a branch of the Columbia. Many who proposed in setting out to go immediately through to California here concluded to go into Oregon, so that the California Company now consisted of only 32 men and 1 woman and child, there being but one family. The 2 companies, after bidding each other a parting farewell, started and were soon out of sight. So again, that 1 woman, Nancy Kelsey, just 18, 19 years of age, carrying the full way her 1-year-old daughter. She's going to try to make this journey to California. And so, again, immediately, the story really dives downhill. It's been a pretty comfortable journey over that established Oregon Trail to this point. But now, look at that. Let's see what Bidwell says here. Sunday, August 16th. Continued our journey over hills and ravines, going to almost every point of the compass in order to pass them. The day was very warm. The grass had been very good, but it was now very much parched up. Thursday, August 19th. Started early, hoping soon to find fresh water, where we could refresh ourselves and animals. But alas, the sun beamed heavy on our heads as the day advanced, and we could see nothing before us but extensive arid plains, glimmering with heat and salt. At length, the plains became so impregnated with salt that vegetation entirely ceased. The ground was in many places white as snow, with salt and perfectly smooth. I'm going to go on a few more. Thursday, August 26th, a week later. Traveled all day over dry, barren plains, producing nothing but sage, which I believe will grow without water or soil. 2 men sent ahead in search of water, but returned a little while before dark, unsuccessful. Having traveled till about 10 o'clock p.m., made a halt and waited until morning. Distance about 30 miles. And then the following day, Friday, August 27th, daylight discovered to us a spot of green grass on the side of a mountain towards which we were advancing. 5 miles took us to this place, where we found, to our great joy, an excellent spring of water and an abundance of grass. Here we determined to stay till the route was explored to the head of Mary's River, and run no more risks of perishing for want of water in this desolate region. So again, they had taken their wagons right down to the northern edge of the Great Salt Lake, and then turned and continued directly west there. Again, there was no established trail, and their animals began to labor and suffer and then give out from pulling wagons through this sandy terrain. And of course, they had no idea what was the right way to go. And so again, they would, as we heard from Bidwell earlier, just following the contour, trying to find a way where they could take their wagons, which led them all over the map. And again, the animals beginning to give out. And finally, we heard Bidwell mention the Mary's River. And this was the one key that had been told to the party. You've got to find the head of the Mary's River, which is today the Humboldt River. And the Humboldt has its head here on the eastern side of Nevada at Pilot's Peak. And you see Pilot's Peak here. And the river then flows to the west, all the way across Nevada, to the point where just short of the California-Nevada border, the river itself simply dries up in the Humboldt Sink. There's no way that the Humboldt really makes its way out to the ocean. It simply dries up out in that great basin where there is no drainage out of the basin. And so again, Bidwell would... So again, right in here, just short of Pilot's Peak, the difficult decision would be made by the party to abandon their wagons, leave their wagons. The animals cannot really pull them any further. They're going to try to pack as much equipment and supplies onto the backs of their remaining mules, horses, and oxen, and they're going to set out on foot with some people riding, some walking. And so from here on out, they're on foot. And they will find the head of the Humboldt, and they will follow it all the way across Nevada quickly as the season is advancing, and they're aware of that. Again, the Humboldt, no scenic great river, and yet water there. Water, you've got to have it. And so, as September is giving way to October, they reach the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. They have no idea of how to cross that range of mountains, but they know they must. And so now they're going to approach the Sierras and cross them. And of course, we can all appreciate there how you're worn out. And the cooperative spirit that maybe was certainly strong as the party would leave the Missouri, with all of the wagon train experiences, that cooperative spirit began to wane there as the physical demands of this journey began to tell on people as well as horses and mules. And so again, they're facing the greatest challenge of their journey. And here again, this map just suggests to us how later, after the gold rush, a whole network of crossings into California developed on that California trail. Just remember that the Bidwell party had none of that. Bidwell would say again, we simply followed the setting sun. We knew California lay to the west, and that was the extent of our knowledge. And so, to face up to that and to think about trying to make it over these mountains with still snow-capped peaks was simply a daunting, daunting challenge. Saturday, October 16th. This morning, 4 or 5 men started to ascend several of the high peaks to ascertain if it was possible to pass the mountains. Just as they were going to start, Captain Bartleson came up. And this was really the co-leader of the group, John Bartleson from Missouri, along with Bidwell. Captain Bartleson came up. Bartleson had been all but angry with the slow pace of the party, and he had taken his 9 additional men that he had come from Missouri with. They had taken their horses and supplies and left the smaller party, left the rest of the party to try to go on by themselves. Now here they are. They've been out there. He was in rather a hungry condition and had been traveling several days without provision. We killed yesterday the best ox we had, and this we shared freely with them. There were now but 3 oxen left, and they were in very poor condition. But there was no time to lose. The explorers returned and reported that they thought it almost an impracticability to scale the mountains, which continued to increase in height as far as they could be seen. Friday, October 29th. Although our road was tolerably level today, yet we could see no termination to the mountains. This is a week later. No, it's more than that. Nearly 2 weeks. We could see no termination to the mountains, and one mountain much higher than the others terminated our view. Mr. Hopper, our best and most experienced hunter, observed that, quote, if California lies beyond those mountains, we shall never be able to reach it. Most of the company were on foot in consequence of the horses giving out. Again, they did succeed in just a handful of days to climb from that eastern escarpment up the eastern side of the Sierras and cross the crest at 9,400 feet But then the real test was coming down the much broader western side of the mountains. And again, here on one of the last days on the trail, Bidwell would leave the party just to explore and scout ahead, and when he came back to the group, he would find that someone had killed a single wolf. And everyone had already made their breakfast of the wolf, and they said to Bidwell, here's your share, the windpipe. That was all that was left for John's breakfast. Great. So again, that last mountain that they had seen blocking their view turned out to be Mount Diablo, right there at the southern end of the San Francisco Bay.
Wow.
Saturday, this is the following day. Most of the company on foot, horses giving out. Saturday, October 30th. We had gone about 3 miles this morning when lo, to our great delight, we beheld a wide valley. This we had entirely overlooked between us and the high mountain which terminated our view yesterday. Rivers evidently meandering through it, for timber was seen in long extended lines as far as the eye could reach. And then the following day, Sunday, October 31st, bore off to the northwest direction to the nearest timber. Day was warm, plain dry and dusty, reached timber which was white oak, and finally the river which we had left in the mountains. Joyful sight to us poor, famished wretches, with 3 exclamation marks. Hundreds of antelope in view, elk tracks, thousands, killed 2 antelopes and some wild fowls. The valley of the river is very fertile, and the young tender grass covered it like a field of wheat in May. And so, that really kind of concludes Bidwell's journey, not my program. Hold on. Again, there, the lower left, another Jackson painting, and the upper, another painting of that time period, and what the Oregon Trail experience really evolved to. A heralded part of the American experience, and again, the Mormons would later come across the trail. They would go to Europe and enlist Europeans who were struggling in life and promise them, come to the new Eden here and find a new life and perfection with God. And so the Mormons would set out across the trail with hand carts. And groups would be caught out there by early winters with disastrous consequences. But really, the gold rush and the tidal wave of people pouring across on the Oregon-California Trail, which really came to an end in about 1868-69 with the finishing of the Transcontinental Railroad. This would become really the American saga. And this painting here in the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, westward, the course of empire makes its way. So there again we can glimpse what the story came to symbolize for those of that time and immediately after. And here another great artistic portrait from 1871. American Progress was the name of this painting. And again, you can see so much here. This American story, far to the right there, you can see the cities. And you can see now people, the trains are making their way. The stagecoaches and wagons are leading the way. Indians and animals are fleeing the approach there of this new way of living and finding her way through the air. Above it all was Columbia with the star of knowledge in her hair there. She's got the telegraph coil wire in her arm and uncoiling that, and the Bible there in her right arm. And so again we can see the imagery that really grew out of this trail experience. And again, Bidwell would leave one of the best accountings of this trail. Bruff was a trained engineer, map maker, and he would become inflamed with the story of gold in California. And he would start out with that famous surge of people, the 49ers, in 1849. And Bruff's sketches in his journal were just great there, showing what that overland experience was like there. He would show us Chimney Rock, and he would show us the experience of going up on top of Independence Rock and leaving your name up there. With information now, this trained engineer map maker. And this little collage, Bruff is of somewhat interest to we right here in Butte County, because his party came down the Lassen Trail from Deer Creek Meadows, where Highway 32 hits Highway 36 up there just short of Chester and Lake Almanor. The group would camp and then head down the Lassen Trail. And the Lassen Trail quickly was seen as all but unpassable in the fall. There was no water and no grass on these high ridge tops coming right down Mill Creek. So Bruff and his group would all but just come to pieces there. Right at the edge of the conifer forest, as they were faced with dropping down into the foothill stretch of the Lassen Trail. Bruff himself had injured himself. He was unable to proceed there from that campsite there we see on the top, and he would end up staying the whole winter by himself in that Bruff camp. And there on the lower left you see Bruff and his little dog, yes, his dog companion, coming out of their shelter with the grizzly bear standing right there. And then that lower right picture, a Bruff picture with the inscription, what's it say? The fate of many. Here a bunch of wolves, coyotes, and bears are digging up the bodies of people buried out there along the trail in just makeshift shallow graves. Wow. So again, the trail experience would come to an end there with the railroad, 1869. The map, of course, of the United States now can stand like this, with really the detail and the understanding nearing completion. Again, pictures like this continued to portray that whole experience in a hallowed light. Yeah. Really, it had been a very difficult experience. About 500,000 people would make that overland journey to both Oregon and California. about 50,000 people would die on the way. Most of those deaths were from disease, from cholera, which would spread out there in contaminated waters there, lack of hygiene, and cholera would set into these groups and kill just randomly. Again, we know the story. The people that were already there in North America had to melt away before this push and this rush of a new way. And we see over there on the right what happened to the buffalo, a mountain of skulls there.
That's bad.
So yes, lots of shadows and dark spots in this story. We know the Bidwell story. Bidwell has a dream of a American Eden, a perfected landscape there where people could live in near harmony with the natural world and create a new Garden of Eden on the landscape. We can see today where it's gone. It's pretty developed and maybe overly developed. We can see how the technology has just mushroomed and exploded. People traveling in wagons just 150 years ago. My own grandmother, who I knew well, born 1880 right outside of Chico, grew up with animals, pulling wagons and carriages. That's the only way she knew how to get around, to ride a horse. Now look, we all know this. Again, the California dream. The California dream. And again, I don't mean to make little of it or even make fun of it. But possibly, has it gone too far? Very possibly. We're challenged with reframing our whole story. And we see this playing out through our culture today. And many find it easy to make judgments about the past, not believing that the past was just a backward extension of the present.
No.
And that's not right. The past, I've heard it said, was a different place. Not only with different technology, different tools, but a different understanding about everything.
Yeah.
A different consciousness. And so to make a judgment about what people did then, I don't think holds up. Again, another story. California had the most beautiful conifer forests in the world. Yep, we got to cutting them down early. We made a bunch of boards out of them and made houses out of them. And now we've got that lower right. Fires that burn out of control because we changed the very nature of the forest and really left ourselves vulnerable. So these last few frames, again, just wonder about this California dream. Look at that. And yes, millions flocked to this beautiful land because there was virtually no winter here. And it was a fertile place with resources, wonderful, wonderful resources. The achievement here, California gave those two words, world class. California gave meaning to that. This has been a world-class experience here with the achievement across a full spectrum of human endeavor. Oh my golly. A beautiful land, still a beautiful land. And I say here as I close, I don't believe it's really time to give up on it yet. And so I would say that's the end of that Bidwell story from me, but not really the end of the story. And again, I think we all need to be strong in seeing a middle-of-the-road interpretation of our human past, to learn here about how we went from there to here, how we got to this world outside that we've got in our hands now, and of course the challenge about what do we do? What do we do now to try to reestablish some common ground, some way forward? So, that's it.